Morning, Cycon. Welcome back. It's great to see such a full house here again. We have a very, very exciting program ahead of us with excellent keynote speakers to start off. We begin the day with Professor Thomas Reid from King's College London, who will talk about the complicated relationship between humans and machines. And his presentation will also be a special sneak peek to his forthcoming book, which will be published by the end of this month. So very much looking forward to your speech.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for coming, President Ilves. Thank you for coming for this talk. And it's truly humbling to speak in front of this audience at Cycon. And I'm sure some of you know the feeling that I had when I started writing my book. Often I was introduced as first at the Department of War Studies. My boss used to introduce me as, "This is Thomas Reid, he's our cyber war expert." And I always had to cringe because it sounded a bit funny if you work next to a person who's actually working on the First World War, for instance. So I thought, let's write a book, Cyber War Will Not Take Place, to sort this problem out. It didn't quite work because the debate is in better shape than ever, I think. But now I'm trying again because I'm now introduced as the cyber guy. And it's even worse in some ways, and and sometimes I have to roll my eyes and cringe because it does sound a bit strange. So that's the question that I set out to ask in the book. Cyber, where does it actually come from? What is this prefix, this word that we use all the time, every day in these days, so many times? What's its history? So the goal of the book is really to provide historical depth and intellectual depth to this discussion that we're having about the future of technology and security here. But let me just preface my brief talk by saying I'm not trying to change cyber into cybernetic or cybernetics. Cybernetics is where it came from, but cybernetics is dead, and it will remain dead. It's an idea that is still with us in some ways, but the term as such has gone away. And in that, by the way, is a warning, because terminology tends to change rather quickly in this field. So let me give you a glimpse into this most fascinating story. When here on this slide you can see a drawing from the 1940s, from the Second World War, about human-machine interaction here in a ball turret in a B-17 bomber. And below the drawing, you can see a poem that some of you will know, at least the title, Machines of Loving Grace, by Richard Breutigam from 1967. So what happened here is and it's about cybernetics. So cybernetics, as an idea, appealed to people in the military to, imagine 60, 70 years back, this crowd, we would now be talking about cybernetics. But it also appealed just a few years later to counterculture, to hippies, to the Back to the Land community in San Francisco and California, to basically the West Coast, Washington, and to the East Coast, Washington, and the West Coast, in a strange way. And this tension, this contrast, is rather interesting to study for a historian of ideas. So it started with the air defense problem. Because the problem in the Second World War was that the Germans, or all aircraft really at the time, were now flying faster and higher than ever before. And calculating the ballistic trajectory for anti-aircraft fire, artillery fire, was extremely difficult. And you basically needed computers, first human computers and later machines, in order to make those calculations. One of the individuals who worked on a small part of what was known at the time the AA problem, the anti-aircraft problem, or AK in the British military jargon problem, was Norbert Wiener, the chap here in the middle, next to two generals who funded his work. And he understood that the plane, the pilot and the plane were interacting in one system. And that was his starting point when he developed this idea of cybernetics. That's Norbert Wiener with his cat, because why not? But no, more seriously speaking, Norbert Wiener, his book was titled Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. So this is him with the animal, this is him with his slightly bigger than cat-sized machine, which he called Palomilla. Remember Palomilla, because it will come back in a few minutes. Wiener understood that living organisms, or that's what he claimed, that living organisms and mechanic systems, and this is one of these systems he built, function according to the same principle. And he tried to develop that theory. So cybernetics, the theory he came up with, is really a theory of machines. And it was very ambitious. It was not just the theory of one machine, or the machines built at the time. It was the theory of all machines ever into the past and in the future. So, you know, we're looking at the very ambitious 1950s. And he clearly embodies that ambition. So cybernetics comes from the Greek steersman, and hence the steersman in the back of that picture. By the way, the picture was taken by Alfred Eisenstadt, who also took the picture of the nurse on Times Square after V-Day. Anyway, so what is cybernetics about? Just very briefly, 3 buzzwords that I think you should take home. One is feedback. Actually, feedback, the word that we use all the time, comes from cybernetics. We just forgot its heritage. And feedback, for instance, means that a machine is interacting with its environment. Think of a thermostat at your heater at home. It measures temperature and then switches something in order to create stability of temperature. The second notion is interaction between system and environment. It's part of that logic. And here, this machine that you see is designed to keep an equilibrium. I won't explain the details. It's a British machine built also in the late 40s. And the machine really startled contemporaries because these 4 electromagnets that you can see here interacted with each other and changed their behavior according to disturbances. When you flick the switches on one of the boxes, the others adapted their behavior. So this machine became a metaphor and became hugely important in counterculture later. Why? Because the machine, think about this for a moment, broke down the line between system and environment. It's a bit almost like your iPhone. It broke down the line between system and environment because if the 3 of those boxes reacted to the 4th box, what then was the system and what was the environment? That's an extremely important thought in the history of this idea, that the system, the difference between system and environment becomes arbitrary. So the hammer in the hand of a sculptor, for instance, is the hammer part of the system that is the sculptor or the environment? And they claimed, the cyberneticists claimed, that's a completely arbitrary distinction. And finally, the idea of equilibrium, because it's all about stability, creating equilibrium and ultimately systems that are able to adapt and learn on their own. And from here, with these 3 ingredients, feedback, man-machine system integration, the breakdown of the line between the 2, and the idea of equilibrium and adaptation, you had the ingredients for hype. And the hype started already in already in the early 50s. What you see here, some of you may have seen a picture like this, is a part of the SAGE semi-automated ground environment. It's a huge anti-air defense system that the Americans put in place in the late 1950s and early 60s. And this light pistol is one of the predecessors, if you like, of the touch screen or the mouse. It's a form of interacting with a machine. And the hype at the time was, again, quite retro for us today, about intelligent machines. Machines that could become possibly even more intelligent than their human creators. And the myth, or one of the narratives, I hope most of you recognize this picture. This is HAL 9000, the famous computer from Space Odyssey, from Stanley Kubrick's film. Stanley Kubrick's film is based on Arthur Clarke's book with the same title. And Arthur Clarke was directly inspired by Norbert Wiener. We know from his writings, Arthur Clarke's writings, that he was a big fan of Wiener and cybernetics. So Hull is an immediate expression of the cybernetic idea that machines could become like humans. And Hull, famously, of course, starts to act rather like a human being by being concerned about being shut down at some point by the crew. But the key here is, let me give you 3 themes that emerge in this 70-year history. The first one is that we tend to look at the machine through the human being. That's how we interpret the future of machines. And we, again, do this today with the artificial intelligence discussion. We think machines could become like us, intelligent like us, or even more intelligent. And this is a really super important theme, so I'll pop it up again. Machine, looking at the machine through the lens of our human experience. Now, the opposite also happened. This is the most bizarre picture. I always feel bad putting up this picture because it's so horribly sexist. But this is the late 50s, and this is what you see here is an Air Force manipulator designed to handle nuclear material for a nuclear propulsion system. And it's grabbing the arms of this lady because to show that it has feedback mechanisms in its claws and it doesn't hurt this fragile, the fragile arms of this woman. And of course, but it's a human in the machine itself. So this is, if you like, a crude cyborg, cybernetic organism. The idea here was that humans could be enhanced through cybernetics, through machines. And the best vision of this is the idea of the cyborg, which comes from NASA. The idea at the time, this is an articulation of NASA's cyborg concept, was that machines could improve humans to the point that they could practically live in outer space by shutting their mouths and oxygenating the blood through machines, etc. It was pretty crazy, the idea. But remember the craziness. The craziness here is the theme throughout history. It's an important theme. So here, first we have the perspective of thinking the machine through the human experience, and now we have the opposite, thinking the future of machines, thinking the future of humans through machine enhancement. And then, we're now in the 60s, something rather bizarre happens. And that is that counterculture discovers cybernetics. And some of you possibly may recall the Whole Earth Catalog. Can I just ask for a show of hands? Who has ever heard of the Whole Earth Catalog? I'm relieved, a few people. So the Whole Earth Catalog was designed by the crew that created it as a cybernetic feedback loop in print. That was what it was all about. It was a publication designed to connect the community, to connect the counterculture, the back to the land community, by providing a written, printed feedback loop. And of course, that sounds rather familiar because we now call this social media, but this was social media in print. So it's a fascinating precursor to what later actually became social media. We'll get there in a moment. This is Stuart Brand playing with the whole Earth, which was on the front page of the catalog. Stuart Brand, the chap in blonde on the left, he had this idea that the border between system and environment also meant the border between the human system and the environment, the actual green environment, and founded part of the environmental movement directly inspired by cybernetics at the time. But let's not talk about that. Let's talk about military stuff again. A few years later, the Air Force, also fascinated by cybernetics, this is now actually earlier in the late 1970s already, the US Air Force has this idea of what they call virtual space, and it's the space inside the machines. This is before William Gibson even articulated the idea of cyberspace. The Air Force was already flying and fighting, if you like, in virtual space before science fiction even talked about it. This is the portal, if you like, that the Air Force developed, a helmet through which you could see the picture that I just showed you. And of course, so the Air Force, this is was designed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and is the predecessor of, in case we have any pilots or Air Force people here, of helmet-mounted displays that are common today. For instance, also in the F-22. And the idea here was that of virtual space. Point here is, he had the same idea. Stuart Brand now, a few years later, in the early 80s, came up with the idea of the WELL, the whole Earth electronic link, which was indeed the first social media platform, cybernetically inspired, connecting now the community through electronics, through the internet. And here you have the rise of the electronic frontier in that context. This is Jaron Lanier, who had a similar idea to the Air Force, but his budget, as this picture makes clear, wasn't as lavish. But they made do and developed some virtual reality technology. So some of you, I'm sure, have read about the virtual reality hype of the late 1980s, which is where we are now. And this is really a key turning point in this history, because it's the third large theme, and that what was called cybernetic space at the time by Timothy Leary, famous counterculture guru who discovered the computer in the late 70s and thought this is the LSD of the 1980s, because now you can shape your own perception and shape your own worlds. He coined the word cyberdelic at the time. I thought some of you might appreciate that, because of course, in his mind, the computer had a similar effect to psychedelic drugs. That's where some of that subculture actually comes from. This picture was used in 1987 in the first article to use the word cyber war ever. And again, this is before William Gibson's term was used outside science fiction ever in Omni magazine. And the key theme here is that cyber war at the time was first seen as an optimistic, as something that plays to the advantage of the United States. It's very much in the context of the US is the technically superior nation. And cyber war at the time, of course, it included automation and robotics on the battlefield. The terminology wasn't refined yet. Played to the advantage of the US. And then just a few years later, the idea of the electronic Pearl Harbor came up. Exactly the opposite. If we can win without firing a shot, without using any conventional military hardware, they thought, then we can also lose in the same way. So what you have very quickly is extreme optimism, utopia, paired with extreme pessimism, dystopia. So this tension between the bad and the good, between the utopian and the dystopian, is part of this 70-year history, and you see it again and again and again. And today, with artificial intelligence, we are again going back and forth between these extremes. So cyberspace became a space of battle on the East Coast, if you like, in the military security establishment, conceptually, either to be won or lost. And on the other side, on the West Coast, cyberspace became the space of freedom. The space of freedom, and we're now in the early 1990s, 1991. Some of you will recall that Phil Zimmermann released PGP around that time. Encryption came up, which suddenly enabled encryption, made it possible to defend this space inside the machine, to build a wall and keep the government out. So this ideology that the government is nothing has no business in cyberspace comes from very strongly from this countercultural context from the people who read the whole Earth catalog, dating really back to the late 60s. So there's a very clear line that, and I'm trying to sort of tease that story out in the book. Now, the key theme here is between the cyber war ideology, a narrative, and the cypherpunks. This picture shows, by the way, you see on the, oops, did I went black here appropriately. On the right-hand side, you see John Gilmore from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. You see the EFF T-shirt. And on the right, you have Timothy May, one of the founding cypherpunks, crypto activists of the early 1990s. And why I mentioned these two individuals, this, by the way, on the cover of Wired magazine, famously, in 1993. I mentioned these two individuals because they represent very different parts of the American, if you like, experience. John Gilmore, I'm simplifying, obviously, was more about the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and Timothy May was more conservative, and he had more the Second Amendment rights and guns in mind when they thought about crypto. So crypto is both like free speech as well as guns in parts of that ideology. This is really important, if you like, the aggressive injection, ideological injection into the cyberspace ideology, because now it could be defended by adding strong encryption to cyberspace. And of course, this is the discussion that we're again having today in a rather intense way. I'm teasing those two themes out, the exaggerations. And if you go back to these magazines and discussions and the parties that we had in the late 80s and early 90s, some of that stuff today comes across as really quite out there. And this is an important consideration because a good part of the discussion that we're having today will appear to us 20 years down the road as rather extreme and unnuanced and a bit unhinged. Now, one of my frustrations today, I think we had the discussion about cyber security, cyber conflict. It's quite old now, more than 25 years. Martin Libicki, who's sitting here, wrote about these things in 1994. I think one of your most important articles appeared. Mikko has also been around for a very long time in this discussion. So there's a bit of progress and a bit of maturity. But I'm afraid on the other side, on the side of the crypto activists, if you like, I don't see the same level of maturity. To put it really bluntly, in my mind, mass surveillance is the new cyber war, because the exaggerations that we dealt with in the 90s, we're still dealing with today when we talk about mass surveillance. And I find it sometimes very difficult to stomach some of the media coverage post-Snowden, because they either willfully or, just not doing their homework. So many people misread what's in these released files and really provide a rather ideological and ill-informed view of intelligence capabilities today. But that's a separate discussion. Let me conclude by briefly reminding you of Palomilla, Wiener's cat-sized robot. Palomilla fascinated him because he wants to simulate neural conditions with it in the 50s. And but the key thing here is that Palomilla didn't create equilibrium. What Palomilla did is it completely freaked out. It basically had a medical condition all the time. That's what it was designed to have. And this, I think, has become a symbol of parts of the debate, at least early on. When the technology is new, we go into overdrive immediately. We do exactly the opposite of the cybernetic idea. We think the extremes will happen. Cyber war, mass surveillance, artificial intelligence, the singularity, another cybernetically inspired idea. Take the cryptocurrency debate today and some of the ideas that people think, what people think cryptocurrencies will do to the financial system, like completely ignoring all the limitations and frictions that will come up and going to the extreme right away. This is a very common theme, and I wrote the book really a bit as a bullshit detector. So thank you very much. I think we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Introduce yourself and state your affiliation. And a question back there.
For me, it's a bit hard to see, so if you You have to sort of... Oh, there's somebody in the back, yeah.
Paul Duchesne,
Yeah.
Netherlands Defense Academy. Thomas, thank you for your great presentation on the background and the theories behind cyberspace and cyber activities. And I was intrigued by one of your final statements that mass surveillance is the new cyber war. And previously you wrote and argued that the cyber war will not take place.
Yeah.
So that seems to be a paradox in itself. If mass surveillance is a new cyber war, but cyber war hasn't taken place,
Yeah.
how do you combine the two?
Well, because it's quite simple, actually, because mass surveillance is not taking place. No, I mean, I'm serious. Let's look at the technology just for a moment. If we look at, let's take just one snippet, which I think is really important. Many in the audience will appreciate that attention to technical detail is crucial in this debate. Unlike in the nuclear debate, where you don't have to understand detonation mechanisms in order to talk nuclear strategy, here you really have to sometimes understand some of the technical underlying questions. So let's make a quick example, and let me talk about for a minute about metadata in the context of this bulk collection, bulk intercept debate. Metadata, the idea out there is that metadata tells you everything about a human life. We heard these statements even from some senior officials. But in an important way, that's just not true anymore, because so much of the metadata, I mean, feel free to maybe some of you are doing this, open Wireshark and read the entire Wi-Fi traffic that's going through here, intercept, sort of, if you like, on the wire. And what you see in terms of the metadata picture is a lot more confusing than what a lot of people assume. Because a lot of metadata are either not available in, for instance, if you look at HTTPS traffic, the metadata available there are only 2 IP addresses, and leading to between this hotel, say, and Google. So what are the metadata there? There's nothing in there in the metadata alone on that part of the connection that would reveal anything of interest to an intelligence agency. So metadata are truncated often, and there are easy ways to defeat traffic analysis. And Tor, for instance, was designed explicitly for that purpose. Timing also of these connections, just to state another obvious point. If you're connected to Facebook all day long and you're chatting there, or to another app, Telegraph, Signal, whatever it is, the timing of the communication isn't as significant as it used to be, because you're connected all the time. It pushes information back and forth all the time. So in some ways, metadata analysis is still possible, and metadata still have value, but it's not more than a target discovery mechanism for more sophisticated intelligence operations targeting endpoints. It's not mass surveillance. And I haven't even started talking about some of the difficulties of working with large data sets in this context. So I don't know, I just have this, maybe because I did this work for this book, this aversion to jump to conclusions very quickly. And this mass surveillance debate, to me, has all the markings of something that we come to regret after a few years, because it's so out of kilter. Sorry, I was...
One more question?
If I may just add, I teach at the Department of War Studies, as some of you know, at King's College, and one of the special things about the department is that it has close interactions with people in the security establishment, military and intelligence community, from different communities from different countries, because these people come to us to study. So when I teach, just like here, I just can't get away with repeating some of the stuff on, to respond to Paul's question on mass surveillance, without having, several of my students either think RID has no idea what he's talking about, which probably still happens, but also just roll their eyes at some of the stuff that's being reported. So I feel, teaching actually is quite a nice, if you like, feedback loop. It makes you more honest and more careful, because the feedback is so immediate. I can very much encourage everybody to engage with people in the security establishment, but I think I'm preaching to the choir on this point. I think, thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you so much. And And we do hope that this little gift will offer you an experience of cyberdelic gardening.
Thank you.
We are resuming our All-Star Cyber Morning. We're very honored to welcome Martin Libicki. He's a researcher at RAND Corporation, author of numerous publications. You are also a professor at the Naval War Academy. And he's also publishing a handbook on cyber war, I think, forthcoming in fall. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, Professor Ridd's talk was an excellent introduction to what I'm about to say. In many ways, he went from World War II to about the early 90s. I'm going to go from the early 90s to about a point 20 years from now. Once upon a time, there was something called information warfare. And then it went away, and what I want to say today is it may be on the verge of coming back. Now, you may be asking yourself, what's this guy talking about? So I'll explain to you. Circa 1992, about 2 decades ago, about 2 years ago, there was the beginning of a notion, particularly within the US defense community, that having seen off the Cold War and having seen the Gulf War, that we were transitioning from an age of industrial age warfare to information age warfare, where the point of a military was not necessarily to get there firstest with the mostest, but to achieve a certain information dominance. That information dominance was a predecessor to dominance over the entire battlefield. And within information dominance, there were many subspecialties. There was the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR, which is the gathering of information necessary for military operations. On the other hand, were the various techniques that one would use against the other side's knowledge or against the other side's certainty. There were many, but 3 of them stand out. One of them is electronic warfare, one of them is psychological operations, and the third one just coming into play could be called cyber warfare, which I'm going to define for my purposes as getting into usurping the command and control of other people's systems to make them do things that the owners of the systems don't want them to do. And so in the mid-90s, you had this thing called information warfare, which was supposedly a unity of thought, which required a unified doctrine, which required a unified theory, and perhaps even a unified organization. But it didn't really work out very well, because what people were doing were bringing together some very, very disparate communities. The ISR folks said, you know, we know what we're doing, and we've been doing it for a long time, and we're going to be doing it even better in the years to come. And you folks are really in the information warfare business. We're really in the information business. So they dropped out fairly quickly. And then the electronic warriors. I don't know if you've ever met any of these guys, but they think of themselves as magicians. They have these dark arts that nobody really understands how they work, and sometimes they themselves don't understand how they work. But they're very good at actually bringing combat aircraft home, and a few other details. And the last thing they wanted to do was to subsume their magic under a bunch of callow geeks. So they excused themselves from the conversation and went back to their specialty. And that left the psychological operators and the cyber warriors, who had one thing in common. Both of them stared at screens for a living. The psychological operators were watching television, and the cyber warriors were watching computer screens. That was back in the mid-90s. They're all watching computer screens now. But I remember attempts to try to build a unified theory, and it fell flat on its face. So what happened, at least in the United States, is that each of these communities went back to their specialties. Cyber war in particular bounced around a lot. It used to be part of the space community. It tried to interact with the information community, and in 2009 it found a home within the strategic community, but really its own home within cybercom. And that's the way we currently think of information warfare within the United States. Now, this isn't necessarily the way it's thought of in other countries. For instance, Russia still clings to a broad theory of information warfare in which psychological operations are at the apex, and the various other forms of information warfare are sort of subsidiary to psychological operations. China developed something called an integrated network electronic warfare, which brings their EW folks together with their cyber war folks, and a few months ago reorganized their military structure so as to bring both of them together with their ISR folks and their space folks. But what I'm going to argue is that we may be seeing a reconvergence of information warfare. And we may be seeing a reconvergence for two reasons. The first reason is that a lot of the other arts of information warfare are starting to look a lot more like cyber war because they're starting to look like the subversion. They're beginning to start looking, how do I say this? How do I put all the verbs together in the right order? The way you start doing psychological operations and ISR and electronic warfare have the same start as the way you do cyber warfare. And the second reason is that we're starting to see a strategic convergence in what you use information war for, and this comes under the general notion of gray zone combat. And as these are two separate converging forces, I want to discuss each of them separately. And I'll start off with a question. Let us say you wanted to get information on 22 million people who used to work, are working, or want to work for the US federal government. There are two ways of doing this. The first way is you painstakingly make a huge record. You collect lots of files, you ask people lots of questions, some of them which are rather impertinent, and you gather the thing together and you house it at the Office of Personnel Management. That's one way. It's a very expensive process. The other way is you hack into the Office of Personnel Management and collect the data all for yourself. It's a great deal simpler. But there's a broader issue here, and that issue is that we tend to think of information collection as done organically and done wholesale. If you take a look at the US military, how do we do ISR? Well, we have satellites, and we have aircraft, and we have ships, and we have UAVs, and we have a lot of machines that are expensively built and expensively operated and do enormous things. This is what I would call organic ISR. It's wholesale ISR, okay? But there's another form of ISR, and that's to collect information from people that have already gone to the trouble of collecting it for you. It's what I would call acquired, and it's more retail. Now, the OPM example is an example of information collected by somebody else, deliberately to collect information. But in fact, there's another way to collect information, and that's to collect it on the each's level, okay? I see several 100,000 people in this room, and if my guess is correct, you're also carrying collectively several hundred sensors, and they're called phones. They're called cell phones, right? There's a record of your interaction with the web. It's a record of the pictures you take. It's a record of where you are. It's a location device, an always-on location device. In other words, you folks are collectively gathering an enormous amount of data, which creates an opportunity for somebody else to collect all of this data for you. And once we get into the Internet of Things, we're multiplying the number of data collecting surfaces by a factor of 10, more or less. And of course, we're not just having intelligent things, but we're having intelligently networked things. So you have a fairly large capability for collecting information from other people. You think about psychological operations, right? In the early 90s, we were an era of mass media. The screens that people watched that I referred to a few years ago was like CNN. It was the news. It was painstakingly collected, centralized in one location, in this case being Atlanta, Georgia, and then redistributed to the rest of the world. And as I don't have to go into any great detail, that's only part of the world we are in right now. We have mass media, but we have social media. And the amount of information flowing through social media is much larger. And more importantly, it's very individuated, okay? It's many to many. It's information about many. It's information about these many going to many other folks. It has become retail. And it also has become an area where, in fact, you can collect a great deal of information and distribute a great deal of information. And the methods of the distribution are not necessarily those of mass media, but those of micro-targeting. I don't necessarily have to send you a message that I send to 100 million other folks if I can send you a message that is specific to you yourself. That I have been able to determine something about what message will appeal to you by collecting this social media data, by analyzing it, and by painstakingly giving it back to you. Now, it's not the field of war in which we've seen this already, but the field of politics. It's the field of direct mail, which was true several decades ago, and it's the field of micro-targeting. You see it in politics, you're seeing it in advertisement. Where you haven't seen it yet is in the field of warfare, but there's no technological reason why that can't take place. I mentioned the Internet of Things, which is, in other words, the Internet of objects that are networked together and capable of performing actions. We haven't seen a great deal of subversion of the items in the Internet of Things, but there's no inherent reason why it can't happen. If you imagine a world of hundreds of millions of interneted cars, particularly if you multiply that world with autonomous vehicles, then it's only your imagination which is going to limit the kind of scenarios you can write. Again, you don't necessarily have to generate mass effects if you have a capability of generating personalized effects. Electronic warfare. That's probably going to remain much in its current state for the bulk of what it does. But many of these Internet of Things devices are also Internet of RF, or radio frequency emanating devices, which means they're capable of generating RF energy in ways that we used to be able to do only by having our own large boxes. I was reminded of this when I read an article several months ago about hacking traffic lights. It turns out the way you hack traffic lights is by getting in close with an RF transmitter at the right frequency, which would suggest that it's not a way of creating mass effects. Until you think about all the RF generating devices which may be near a traffic light. And if you add the tendency towards software-defined radio, which is to say capable of generating at multiple different frequencies, you realize that what was once you had to be relatively close to a target in order to have an effect, no longer applies. And the last one, of course, is the techniques of cyber this and cyber that, cyber warfare, cyber espionage, that haven't gone away at all, in fact, and are available. So what I wanted to get as a conclusion to this is many of the other forms of information warfare that we have pursued through means other than the subversion of machines can now increasingly be pursued through the subversion of machines, and it has the added advantage that it can be tailored to specific individuals. Okay. Having stopped the section on, as it were, tactical commonality, let me talk about strategic commonality and gray zone warfare, which is a sort of warfare you engage in if you don't really want to go to war, which is to say, if you don't really want the other side to go back to war against you. When you take a look at the distinction between cyber war and kinetic warfare, you see 5 major differences, which tells you that cyber war, and by extension information war, is going to be conducted in many ways for different purposes than kinetic conflict. People who talk about cyber as the 5th domain of war, I think underestimate how different it is than kinetic conflict and overestimate the degree to which these two can be combined. What are the 5 characteristics? The first one is obvious. It's non-kinetic. To date, nobody has been hurt by cyber war. Very few things have been broken. Okay? Not to say it couldn't happen, but to say in the last 2 decades we really haven't had that. The second one is ambiguity. Who's doing what to whom is often shrouded in mystery. Are we talking, for instance, about a set of incidents, or are we talking about a campaign? Are we talking about rogue actors that happen to be protected by a state, or are we talking about a state itself? If I see somebody in my system, are they there for the purpose of espionage, or are they there for the purpose of disruption and corruption? How can I tell who has what kind of capability? And it works both ways, right? People talk about net assessment in warfare. I know that you are this powerful because you have this many tanks, and you know I'm powerful because I have this many tanks. And if I want to show you how powerful I am, that's what the 1st of May is all about, right? Take my tanks, roll them down the boulevard, you can count them, question answered. You can't do that in cyber war. And to a large extent, you can't do that in information war, right? I really don't know what the other side has. All I know is what the other side has chosen to show me. And by the same token, it's very difficult to brag about what you have, particularly because it's characteristic of a lot of cyber war and information warfare, that if you talk about the details, you've lost your capability at that very point. So the field is pervaded with ambiguity. Another thing which I don't think is very well realized is persistence. Most people, when they go to war, by the act of going to war, put themselves at risk. But it's not true for most forms of cyber war, where you can literally carry them out anywhere in the world. And by and large, once you have done your initial investment in gaining access, in building your algorithms, in collecting your data, you can go on for a long time without a great deal of refreshment. Which means that cyber warriors, and to a certain extent information warriors, they are very hard to disarm. In fact, it is certainly easy to imagine that the cyber war capabilities of a country can persist well after the country itself has ended. Which means in the combination between ambiguity and persistence, you don't really know when the war started, and you have no particular idea when that war is going to end. Now, the fourth characteristic, almost perversely, is unpredictability. Cyber war and psychological operations and a few of the other aspects are very difficult to predict in advance what kind of effect you're going to have. And this has multiple dimensions. You don't necessarily know what kind of effect you're going to have. You don't necessarily know what collateral damage you're going to create. You don't necessarily know what effect you already have had, because battle damage assessment is difficult, and you don't really know how long it's going to take you to get those sorts of effects. And then the last item is mutability, that the process of creating information war capabilities is basically a contest of measure and countermeasure that tends to proceed faster than it does for the more kinetic issues. Okay, let's put these things all together and what kind of implications can we draw from it. I'd like to start focusing on unpredictability first. Modern military operations require predictability in their support elements. Predictability in many ways is more important than the size of the effect. Let me give you an example from the world of logistics, right? If I'm trying to feed an army, I want to get a month's worth of food to the battlefield every month. It is much better to get a month's worth of the food to the battlefield every month than to get 3 months of perishable food there 1 month and no food the next month, even though on average I'm moving a lot more food, okay? Because the supply isn't predictable. And that's true for food, that's true for POL, and it's true for information. If I want to be able to carry out an airstrike, and I want to have a certain amount of confidence that I've taken out the forward air defense radar in the process of carrying out an airstrike, I don't want something that has a 50-50 chance of taking out every single radar in the country and a 50-50 chance of doing absolutely nothing at all. I'd rather have a 100% chance that I have in fact taken out those few radar that I need to take out in order to complete the mission. And if you cannot promise me a high degree of assurance within the way that modern militaries work, I'm going to be looking for other methods. It's the very unpredictability of cyber war, which I'm prepared to argue doesn't make it a very good fit for conventional combat operations. But if you want to have an effect on society, particularly if you want to have an effect on the other guy's society cumulatively, predictability doesn't play quite the same role. And in fact, one of the tensions within the whole field of cyber war is a tension between its use in the military application and its use in, as it were, against civilian targets. A very similar tension, by the way, pervaded the development of air power in the years between World War I and World War II, and in fact through World War II. Do we use these aircraft to support fielded forces, or do we use these aircraft to go against other countries? And I think one of the developments of air power over the last 100 years was they figured out increasingly how to use aircraft in the support of military operations, to the point where this has become, at least within modern militaries, a primary use, and not something that validates or tries to validate the theories of Trenchard, Mitchell, and Duhay. So that's one implication. The other implication is that it supports a form of warfare that I came into before, called gray zone conflict. In other words, the primary method of gray zone conflict is to try to have Clausewitzian effects without at the same time, Clausewitzian-like effects, there's some true Clausewitzians in the audience, I don't want to get into a debate about this, but to try to have political effects without necessarily forcing the other guy to engage. If you take a look at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, you see a deliberate effort to try to stay below the threshold where NATO feels it has no choice but to intervene. And so far successfully. But that's only one example. If you look at the interaction, say, between Iran and its proxies on the one hand, and Israel on the other hand, you see a lot of low-level conflict, which isn't at the level that would force either country to declare war on the other. And unfortunately, the best example is North Korea versus South Korea. And it's basically a one-way issue. North Korea does a great deal of hacking of South Korea. They've tried from time to time to jam GPS, so there's electronic warfare. There's tons of psychological operations, but the two countries are not yet at the point where both of them feel that they have to go to war with one another. Now, when you couple this with some of the methods that I talked about in terms of gathering information on individuals, you can glimpse a form of warfare that is retail in ways that war has never been retail. In other words, an attempt to change the narrative, change the feeling, and change the psychology of a country by changing the feelings and narratives and the psychology of each of its individuals one at a time, which previously was unavailable, but through a combination of the new cyber war surveillance, data mining, such as it is, and artificial intelligence, such as it may one day yet be, you can start glimmering potentials. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything's been wrapped up, okay? What I have been describing is a lot of red bricks. But the question of how you go from these capabilities to political effect is a great unknown. In other words, I've got the red bricks, but I don't have the blueprint. So the question is, will there, in fact, be a convergence between the red bricks and the blueprint? Will finally somebody figure out how to put it together? And by the way, the answer is not obviously yes in this case. And a secondary question is who, which is to say which country is going to do it? Now, it might seem that the United States may be the first one to put that sort of warfare together, because the United States has unrivaled capabilities in software and unrivaled capabilities in advertisement, particularly political advertising. But I don't think it's going to be the United States. And I don't think it's going to be the United States because it's not consistent with the US theory of warfare. Let me just sort of go on a small tangent about the theory of warfare. It's 1918, or it's in the 20s, and you're looking at the various elements of blitzkrieg, right? The tank, the radio, the aircraft. You could name 5 or 6 countries that could be capable technologically of putting that all together. But it turns out only one country, maybe 1.5 countries, did it. And it turned out to be Germany, because Germany had a theory of war that they started exercising in 1917 and 1918, which was consistent with blitzkrieg, only they didn't have the time and the resources, they didn't have the tools and the resources at the time to do it. But when the tools and the resources came together, the Germans managed to put it together into a new form of warfare. And so the folks who are going to be putting this together, big if it can be put together at all, are the folks that in fact have a theory of warfare for which these are consistent elements. But that doesn't necessarily mean the United States and the West can sit back and let somebody else invent it. Because whereas the United States and the West may not necessarily get to where they are going to invent this theory of war, they certainly have the means to have this war being thrust upon them. It's sort of like if you look at a forest and there's a lot of tinder and scrub around. Tinder and scrub don't make forest fires, but they do mean that the next match that comes along has a good probability of creating a forest fire. Or if you take a look at the chicken and the pig farms of southern China, farms don't turn into flu, but when you have the conglomeration of sort of hosts in one place, your chances of generating a novel form of flu are fairly good. If you look at the United States and the West, right, where we are insisting on collecting everything and connecting everything, we are creating an environment in the West which is conducive to the creation of that form of warfare by somebody else. And maybe, just maybe, one of the things that we should think about as we go into our madcap dash to the Internet of Things and to total connectivity and to God only knows what else, is a kind of environment that we may be creating for people who don't necessarily have our interest at heart. And with that, I shall take, or attempt to take, questions.
Any questions? Are there any questions?
Yes. Or you call them.
Hi, Martin. Jay Healy from Columbia University. And it's interesting, I especially like that last part where you're talking about the BRICS and the blueprint. But certainly there are a number of countries, Russia in particular, that think the United States is putting together these information capabilities, that there is this blueprint, that there is this larger plan.
Yeah.
So can you maybe kind of pull that apart and how you see, to get to Thomas's, this feedback between what countries think the United States might be doing and how that's leading them down their own path?
The Russians think a great many things, only some of which are actually true. I mean, if we had as much power as the Russians ascribe to us, we would be the colossus that they think we are, right? I mean, they have ascribed all of the color revolutions to us, the Arab Spring to us, that we are the hand behind everything, okay? The Russians have their own reasons for believing this stuff, and at some point, you have to shrug and you have to say, ideas are not responsible for the people who believe in them.
Lior Tabansky, Tel Aviv University. As you're an American, I'm Israeli, we're outsiders of Europe, and there's a lot of things that we hear in Estonia and other countries about Russian information warfare affecting the West. What's your take on this? Is this real? Maybe the Russians are the first to get these combinations in place and already practicing it?
It's possible. I mean, that was sort of the words that did not come up in my talk, okay? Russia, what did Winston Churchill say? An enigma wrapped in a mystery and one other piece of sandwich in that thing. Russians are very good at software. The Russians think they're very good at persuasion. Well, I'm not a political scientist, and you may disagree with me on this, but here's my opinion. 3 years ago, if you took a look at the country in Ukraine, it was a 50-50 country. Half of it looked west, half of it looked east. Today, 90% of Ukraine is still Ukraine, and 90% of what is now Ukraine looks west, not east, okay? This, to my mind, is not a strategic victory, right? 2007, you had the Russian DDoS attacks in this very town, right? Did this make Estonia more pro-Russian? I don't think so. So I think the Russian notion of persuasion needs a great deal of work, that in many ways they're trapped within their own mirrors. Now, we are all trapped within our mirrors, right? I am not the one who said that, I'm not going to argue that the United States understands the world better. If you spend enough time in the United States, you realize what a large provincial country it is. But I'd like to think that we haven't drunk quite so much of our own Kool-Aid. I'd like to think.
Do we have one last question? That would be the last one. Yep. The gentleman here.
Hi, Matthias Schulze from Jena University in Germany. I too was puzzled by the fact that information warfare vanished from US military doctrine, but I was wondering whether this is due to the simple reason that it is incredibly hard to do to manipulate enemy leadership by planting an idea somewhere in a network. Maybe is this the reason why this disappeared, and maybe is this the reason why we won't actually see it, to make a counterpoint to your brilliant argument?
There were a lot of claims made for information warfare that turned out to be suspicious at the time and fell flat on his face. One of them was nodal targeting, right? We don't have to hit everything, we just have to hit that one node. The same people who were doing this didn't understand how the internet worked, which is a very mesh-like network. That the notions of being able to take out one computer and everything collapses becomes less and less true by the year as you get a denser and denser networking going on. Okay? By the same token, a lot of the changes in the physical networking are also changes in the human networking at the same time. And that one of the things that computers have done is flatten organizations. And by flattening an organization, by managing yourself as a bunch of teams, your susceptibility to the loss of any one node goes down correspondingly. Which probably doesn't answer the question, but I decided to talk about it anyway.
Thank you, Martin. Another round of applause for Martin. Here's your piece of Cyber Garden.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Third keynote of the day will be Cycon's dear friend and our